Vernacularization is understood as a general approach to locate architecture by alluding to indigenous social, cultural, political, and historical context. Through vernacularization, a foreign concept is made understandable to the local audience by referring to familiar local materials and ideas. The architecture here in the Philippines reflects the country's historical and cultural heritage. Most prominent historic structures in the archipelago are based on a mix of indigenous Austronesian, Chinese, Malay, American, and of course, the Spanish influences. For today, I, together with my group, will be discussing the architectural discourses here in the Philippines. We are going to chew over Felipe de Leon Jr.'s Defining the Filipino Through the Arts, from Specialistic Innocence to Participatory Consciousness, and of course, Edson Roy Cabal-Finn's Condensing the Country, Identity Politics in the Design of Nayong Pilipino or the Philippine Village, and the Expo Filipino 1998 theme parks and his vernacularization in the Philippine modern architecture.
Felipe M. De Leon Jr., a professor of art studies, University of the Philippines in Diliman, where he teaches humanities, aesthetics, music theory, and Philippine art and culture, and professional lecturer on courses in social transformation, such as language and social transformation, semiotics, mythology, and institutional dynamics, and accompany people's movement at the Asian Social Institute in Paco, Manila. He was the commissioner and head of the subcommission of arts of the National Commission for Culture and Art, and the chairman of its National Committee for Music from 2004 to 2007. He was also chairman of Gawa da Manlilikha ng Bayan or the National Living Treasure Awards from 1993 to 2007 as well. Felipe De Leon, in his reading material Defining the Filipino Through Art, stated arts can promote diversity of information. Also for him, through arts, we can find form and materials. But as Filipinos, we define arts from specialistic innocence to participatory consciousness. The Philippines Humanities Review by Felipe De Leon Jr. gave out key points how arts were defined in the Philippines. First is the cultural identity. It is the basis of social participation for the development. It's a sine qua non for becoming active in the world. It is also fundamental source of social empowerment to involve people as active participants. Development must be consistent with their fundamental social cultural trait, worldview, and values, and cultural principle. The belief system, knowledge, skill and practices, core principle and ideas are shared by a society. Second is the genesis of subservience. The objective is to colonize power that erases the cultural memory of conquered people, to induce a collective amnesia about their past and supplant it with the culture of the colonizer. Third, serving another country's need through education. According to Hornedo of 1997, it's look like the Philippines is spending its money for training of manpower for more affluent countries. The essence of our colonial education, the training of one's citizen to become another country's asset. For us to be part of liberal education, one that can promote this kind of Asian values of communal togetherness, national unity, spiritual oneness of humanity, and especially the Filipino ideal of pakikipagkapwa, whose deepest meaning of is shared goodness or shared divinity. Fourth is about the overly technical education. Mostly, it is the vocational-oriented training that must be balanced by humanistic and cultural education. We should educate people, especially children, in what it means to be human, especially in a world and also with another sentient being. The fifth one, and one of the most important things that we should know, is the professional tribalism. Many are afraid that they overemphasize technical and professional education that may develop expertise and professions, but it also breeds selfishness, lack of social responsibility, and what we call professional tribalism, which arises from cult of professional ego.
Sixth key point is about the alliance from the community, since our educational system is highly westernized. It follows that one ascends as academic ladder, the one westernized and alien for his culture roots or the become Filipino. Next is intention from our School of Cultural Energy. Our educational system remains colonial rather than cultural inappropriate, causing the great loss of cultural energy. As a result of many our schools do not produce people who are highly resourceful, creative, and adaptable to fast-changing and extremely complex contemporary world. They encourage deficiency, a job-seeking employability mentality rather than originality of thought, entrepreneurial qualities, and self-reliance, native skill, knowledge, and strengths. Next is the eighth key point instead is about the power indigenous to harness our own minds, understanding definition, categories, and concepts. This is essentially to have the confidence, power, and control over our own lives. Economic power naturally follows from his from instant if we worship an alien ideas of beauty, whose are artwork, music, fashion, models, and beauty products do we glorify and spend for. This reliance on our own traditional does not mean, however, that become blind new, perhaps better ideas from the culture. But our traditional should remain as the basis because they are consonants with our psyche and our needs, containing wisdom tested through the time. Likewise, Asian Chinese acupuncture successfully blended with Western medicine has been receiving a lot of worldwide recognition and scientific validation in recent times, earning for Chinese not only prestige but material rewards. The next is Doña Victorina's syndrome. The alliance from our race, what Felipe called Doña Victorina syndrome, is a low self-esteem, bordering on self-contempt. It is based on the name of pathetic caricature of colonial psyche in the 19th century novel Noli Me Tangere of Dr. Celsal. Doña Victorina despises her race so much that she has to marry a white man, a Spaniard who is scoundrel just to raise her social stature instead of proudly wearing her brown skin and assert its rich dignity and beauty. She tries to hide the under-thick face of white powder just like what many Filipinos essentially still do today. 10 aspect of defining the Filipino true arts from the specialistic innocence to the predatory consciousness. It is the alliance from the indigenous regarding to the local tools in the Filipino society until now. We put at the top of the social ladder those who are the most westernized and the bottom those who are the least. This places the Maluleño at the top, followed by the provincial city dweller, then poblacion or town dweller. Next is taga barrio or taga bukid or what we call from province. And lastly comes is taga bundok, especially if taga bundok is indigenous or one of the so-called minorities who are many Filipinos regard are almost subhuman. If only Malileños realized that the Filipino New Yorkers look down on him too. Fortunately, our westernized education makes it very difficult. Most Filipinos do not look down on our indigenous people living in the mountain that were made able in the school were books containing scenery of wealthy American urban life. Next is few many reasons on how we define Filipino through the arts. From the specialistic innocent to the particular consciousness. Now, let's proceed to reading the material. Edison, the Roy Cavifin, Edison, the country, identify the politics, and the design, and Nayong Filipino, Philippine Village, and the 1998 Expo Filipino Theme Park, and Vernacularization, Philippine Modern Architecture.
Governments often employ various modes to communicate national identity to local and international audiences. Set within the ideology of nationalism, which demands a sense of distinctiveness and cultural identity, nations have often turned to architecture to express such identity. Together with architecture, World's Fairs, international exposition, theme parks, and parades, other forms of public spectacle are also used to convey national identity because of their public and dramatic nature. In this article, the process of condensing, or the act of distilling the essence of the country into its radicable elements, is inspected in terms of the ways the idea of the nation is articulated through theme parks. Theme parks are specifically used by national governments to create an abridged summary of the nation, be it a geographical collage or a historical synopsis. The parks, originally designed for entertainment and commerce, also embody educational aims. Entertainment showcases usually considered exotic, fantastic, and atypical as compared to the everyday lives of the fairgoers. This article investigates how the Philippine government used architecture and ephemeral events in theme parks as methods of post-colonial self-fashioning by looking at two post-independence case studies. Nang Pilipino, or the Philippine Village Theme Park, which opened in 1970 in Pasay City, and the 1998 Expo Pilipino in Clark, Pampanga. The Nang Pilipino, or the Philippine Village Theme Park. Nang Pilipino was the brainchild of former First Lady Imelda Marcos, who was also responsible for other cultural institutions in the country, like the Cultural Center of the Philippines. The park covered about 22 hectares over a 47-hectare property adjacent to what was then the Manila International Airport. Here you'll find a unique Filipino village, otherwise called Nayong Pilipino, contained within a 45-acre amusement theme park type environment. This park is essentially a representation in a miniature version of the diverse Philippines and its culture, all in one place. The theme park was touted as the first of its kind in Southeast Asia. It featured models of tourist destinations of the country, such as the Mayon volcano in the Albay province, the Banawe rice terraces in the Cordilleras, the historical houses of Bigan, Ilocos Sur, the Chocolate Hills of Bohol, and the Magellan's Cross in Cebu. Philippine Centennial International Exposition 1998, also known as Expo Pilipino, was a world fair organized as part of the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Philippine Independence on June 12, 1898. The event, which featured Philippine history and culture, was held in a 60-hectare site at the Clark Special Economic Zone in Mabalacat, Pampanga. The exposition, including its site, was a project of the National Centennial Commission, or NCC, and the Philippine Centennial Exposition Corporation. The Expo Pilipino had a 35,000-seat amphitheater which was used as a site for concerts, ecumenical services, and political rallies after exhibitions at the complex were halted. The exposition had a projected 150 investors participating as of May 1998. Expo Pilipino was as much as a fictive history of the Philippines as any that have preceded it. It was an attempt to invent a national past that depicted all the ethnic communities of the Philippines as part of a common historical experience with shared origins in a pre-Hispanic culture. Moreover, it strove to persuade these people that the nation-state is their best hope in leading them towards greater social, economic, and cultural progress. The organizers and planners of the 1998 exposition suffered the same uncritical perspective as the designers and organizers of the early 20th century Philippine villages in the colonial world's fairs. The use of vernacular architecture, ethno-linguistic displays, and natural geological features were thought to be a political representations of the Philippines. But the organizers failed to see high politicized process of exhibition and display, resorting to the pre-colonial vernacular architectures as design reference did not necessarily free the exhibitions of the problems associated with primitivism and exoticism.
Let us now proceed to the identity politics and nation building By looking at Nayong Pilipino and 1998 Expo Filipino, one could argue that despite being in the post-colonial period or the era after the colonial experience, the Philippines has not fully achieved the post-colonial situation or a complete process of decolonization. Although considered as post-colonial representation of the Philippines, these two case studies show that the country had not escaped the colonial narratives reminiscent of the 1887 Exposition General de las Islas Filipinas in Madrid and the 1904 St. Louis Fair. Both the 1887 and 1904 colonial expositions showcase indigenous Filipinos in reconstructed houses set within a park-like setting. The Filipinos and their indigenous houses, rendered in earthly palm, grass, wood, and bamboo, were set in contrast to the gleaming glass and steel structures of the colonizers found elsewhere in the fairgrounds. This act of condensing can be connected to what political scientist Benedict Anderson described as the creation of homogeneous empty time and the subsequent homogenization of space as prerequisite of nationhood. In the formation of nations, Anderson argues that for a community to imagine a sense of unification, technologies such as newspapers enable to create simultaneity in space and time. This article thus also furthers Anderson's argument by proposing theme parks, much like expositions and ephemeral events, are technologies that facilitate the creation of homogeneous space and time. For the post-independence Philippines to be considered modern, its government thus utilized these theme parks to create a unified and syncretic image. Nayong Pilipino and Expo Filipino both illustrate the strategy of condensing the country as part of post-colonial nation-building processes. Nayong Filipino by grafting different examples of houses, cultures, and national geographical features into one theme park, condense the country under a single homogeneous national space. Expo Filipino, similarly grafting different historical periods and cultures, condense the country into one homogeneous national time. A sense of syncretism is achieved as various time periods, cultural context, and geographical location are completed and consumed within one bounded area. By doing so, disparate elements, cultures, peoples, and historical periods are made accessible to a certain audience or population segment, whether for political or commercial purposes.
There are places and structures that got featured in Nayong Pilipino Theme Park and in 1998 Expo Filipino. Where the Nayong Pilipino represented region contains a typical residential building, a landmark structure or representation of Filipino geography, including characteristics of landscape indicative of the specific regions. Visiting these structures is like taking a trip using a time machine to another perspective of time and place in the Philippine history. The first is the Baraswain Church. Baraswain Church was derived from Filipino words, Baras ng Suwail, which means Dungeon of the Defiant. This is the place where Filipinos would congregate the people who were defiantly in opposition to the laws brought by the conquerors of the Philippines in the past. The church was originally named after a historic church in Navarra, Spain. Many historic events, revolutionary movements, have occurred at the original Baraswain Church, located in Malolos, Bulacan, in the Philippines. The beautiful structure recreates the historic church in its entire splendor. Next is the Kalinga Village, a landlocked province in the northern section of Cordillera region. The name Kalinga was derived from Ibang and Gada, which means headhunters. In the past years, headhunting was considered noble. It symbolizes bravery amongst men. Beautifully remote region. Tourist sites include waterfalls, hot spring, rice terraces, and subterranean rivers. Nayong Filipino Clark allows individuals us to take a peek to the rich Kalingan way of life, to their beautiful structures, history, and lastly, the terrain. The third one is the house of Dr. Jose Rizal. Dr. Jose Rizal is a Filipino with great and varied learning. He was also a true nationalist, and during the Spanish colonial era, he was one of the most well-known supporters for the transformation of rule the Spaniards here in the Philippines back then. He always promoted peaceful means of revolution rather than a forceful or violent one. Two novels were written by Dr. Jose Rizal, which exposed the cruelties of the Spanish colonizers in the Philippines. So those two books were Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. The Spaniards were concerned. The two novels that would start a propaganda that make the Filipino people revolt against them. He was sentenced for a trial on December 30, 1896 and was shot firing squad at Bagumbayan, now known as Luneta Park. Those are just some structures that got represented and replicated in the Nayong Pilipino. Let us now move to the 1998 Expo Pilipino. A tableau of Maria Makiling, the chosen island, was featured in the said exposition. Maria Makiling, more properly known as Mariang Makiling, is a diwata or a lambana or a fairy in the Philippine mythology, associated with Mount Makiling in Laguna, Philippines. She is widely known as a diwata. She was venerated as a goddess in pre-colonial Philippines. She is known as Dayang Masalanta or Dayan Masalanta, who was invoked to stop the deluges and the Freedom Ring of 1998 Expo Filipino. This project was criticized for its excessive amounts of money put into a construction. The particular targets of criticism were the Freedom Ring that cost 1.2 billion pesos, a parking lot that cost 111 million pesos, an entry zone that cost 118 million pesos, play villages which uses 290 million pesos, an artificial river that cost 76 million pesos that had bridges spanning it which totaled for 32 million pesos. Expo Filipino closed down in 1999 under the administration of President Joseph Estrada, which allegedly after sustaining heavy losses.
Now, let us have a quick discussion about Edson Roy Cabelfin's vernacularization in Philippine modern architecture. One strategy in expressing a distinct national character is through the idea of vernacular in architecture. As I have said in the beginning of the presentation, vernacularization is understood in this case as a general approach of localizing architecture by alluding to indigenous social, cultural, political, and of course, historical context. Through vernacularization, a foreign concept is made understandable to the local audience by referring to familiar local materials and ideas. The pre-1945 American colonialism and architecture. Americans during the first half of the 20th century used urban planning as a means of establishing colonial control here in the Philippines. Daniel Burnham, the famed architect and planner who designed in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and San Francisco, was asked to redesign the capital city of Manila in 1905. Under his plan, Manila became a rationalized and organized system of circulation networks, activity zones, and open spaces that emphasized efficiency, order, and progress, following closely the principles of the City Beautiful movement. After Burnham finished the plan, a substantiation of the new urban design was passed on to William Parsons, who was hired as the chief consulting architect of the Philippine Bureau of Public Works. He was then tasked to create the new architectural imagery for the Manila cityscape. We can safely conclude that Burnham and Parsons shared the view that the existing Spanish colonial architecture is considered indigenous. Therefore, it is something that is to be preserved, and the more so, serve as an inspiration for future designs. Indeed, Parsons' architectural schemas of major public structures in the archipelago, such as the Philippine General Hospital in 1910, Manila Hotel in 1912, and the University of the Philippines in 1913, were distinctively Spanish in detail, but neoclassical in its overall form. Generally, these hybridized civic buildings represented modernity, progress, and democracy, which is a constant reminder of the supposed benevolence of American colonial rule. Another aspect of this vernacularization was Parsons' emphasis on the tropical climate. His responses were very practical. Parsons invested in the combination of conch shell or louvered window system patterned after Spanish colonial houses found in the Philippines. The Gabaldon Schoolhouse, for example, which was the prototype for all schoolhouses built during the American colonial period, is significantly open on all sides but covered with the Capiz shell louver window system. These very tropical responses came to be Parsons' signature style throughout his career here in the Philippines.
The post-1945, post-coloniality and architecture. After the historic Declaration of Independence from the United States in 1946, the period after World War II signaled renewed interest in things Filipino. The idea of Filipino, wherein the arts, literature, history, sciences, and technology stood out as the rallying point for nationalist movements. At that time, being Filipino meant having a distinct and essential national culture different from other world culture. During the 1960s and 1970s, under the rule of Marcoses, architecture was seen as the avenue for Filipinoness. First Lady Imelda Marcos, for example, advocate a return to supposedly folk culture as means of achieving a genuine national Filipino identity. In architecture, this quest for national identity was embodied in the search for a Philippine national style. Experimentation with the national style usually highlighted literally reinterpretation of forms from indigenous architecture. Roof forms, because of their high visibility, were usually the first to be borrowed. The roof shape of National Arts Center in Laguna and the Transfiguration Chapel in Bukidnon, both by national artist Leonardo Locsin, derives its overall shim from Cordillera architecture found in the northern part of the archipelago. Architect Francisco Mañosa also attempted to develop a Filipino look in his designs by focusing on indigenous materials. The Coconut Palace, as its name suggests, explores and exploits the various application of materials derived from the coconut tree. In another project, Pearl Farm Resorts, Mañosa focused on bamboo as the primary material for the beach pavilion. The roof forms probably took its cue from the houses of the Snake people in the northern part of the Philippines, which made use of overlapping split bamboo nuts. Bamboo, like coconut, is indigenous, pervasive, and endemic in the Philippines. Other approaches of vernacularizations avoid literal interpretations of forms and instead extract abstract concepts. For example, Leandro Locsin designed the cultural center of the Philippines with the floating masses concepts in mind, drawing from images of indigenous houses lifted above the ground via stilts. Locsin stylistically abstract this floating quality through the interplay of large concrete masses and glass walls.
The history and culture of the Philippines are reflected in its architectural heritage and the dwellings of its various people. In churches and mosques, and in the buildings that have risen in response to the demands of progress and the aspirations of the people. Architecture in the Philippines today is the result of a natural growth and reach with the absorption of varied influences. The aftermath of the Second World War left nothing but destruction in its wake, and a time of rebuilding ensued. The Filipino style found its way in the re-emergence of traditional motifs.
That would be all. We, the last group presented, we're hoping that you have gained a new set of knowledge, especially how the architecture here in our country, Philippines, got influenced, emerged, and of course, developed. We're hoping that all of the learnings you have obtained from us will be beneficial to each and everyone as we go along pursuing this field. Thank you and God bless us all.